Let your loving kindness, O Lord, be upon us as we have put our trust in you. Please be seated. I didn't expect, before coming to Nashville for this field placement, to spend some of my time sitting in on meetings with architects and developers. I had heard that Nashville was growing quickly, but it's one thing to hear about it and another to see it every day. The new buildings going up just outside the church, the daily shutters of dynamite. I didn't know that Christ Church has its own part in this. The anticipated new building on Lot C, a possible new construction for the church's own facilities. I've noticed since being here that there's a lot of anticipation and a lot of waiting related to the new build. Permits need to be approved, the city needs to be consulted, the architects need time to draw up and revise possible schemes, working to ensure that the new building will contribute to the growth and flourishing of the people who use it. Those of you who have been here for a long time now know that this is not a quick process, and that what you think should take weeks might take months, and what you think should take months might take years. But the end is in sight. There are proposed schemes from the architect for the church's facilities and a timeline from the builders on Lot C. It may be a few years before everything is finished, but very soon you'll be able to see it begin. The dust and the mess from the construction site, while inconvenient, will at least be a sign that there's movement, that change is coming, that something new is on the way. Abraham and Sarah, as we read in the epistle to the Hebrews today, knew something of this anticipation for a new place. But for them, the writer of Hebrews tells us, it's a heavenly city that they await, a city whose architect and builder is God. I love the story of Abraham and Sarah, but it's a hard one. Let's review for a moment. Abraham and Sarah are old, and they've never had children. One day, God tells Abraham to get up and go to the land that God would show him. That is, he didn't know where he was going. As their relationship deepens, God makes a covenant with Abraham, promising to be his God and to make Abraham and Sarah into a great nation, to give them a homeland so that they could be a blessing to all the nations of the world. Through these two promises, land and children, they are blessed to be a blessing to all. The author of Hebrews tells us that Abraham and Sarah had faith and believed that God would be faithful to fulfill God's promises. But the epistle doesn't give us the texture of their story. Abraham and Sarah heard the promises, and they did believe that God would be faithful to the covenant that God made with them. But the years started to go by. They were still living in tents in a land that was not their own, and they still didn't have any children. They believed the promises, but they didn't see how they could be fulfilled. Do you ever doubt that the promises of God will be fulfilled? Or do you wonder what God promises at all? When you are sick and tired of the pain of this world, do you long for that other city, but have a hard time seeing it or imagining it? There are prophecies in the Old Testament that begin to tell us about this other future place where things will be different from the way that they are here. There's such beautiful language around it. Isaiah says that the wolf will lie down with the lamb, the leopard with the young goat, the calf and the lion and the yearling together, and a little child will lead them. In Joel, we read that in that day the mountains will drip with wine, and that milk will flow from the hills. There will be enough and more than enough for everyone. The prophet Micah tells us that spears and swords will be bent and changed so that they can only be used for growing crops, that nation will not lift up sword against nation, and no one will learn war anymore. Jesus, too, tells us all kinds of stories about what it will be like there in that heavenly city. A banquet where everyone who is poor and disabled and left out is invited in, the first ones through the door. It's a pearl that's worth more than everything else you have, so you're wise to sell everything to buy it. It's a place where a wayward son who leaves and squanders his family's wealth is welcomed home with a party and a kiss. I hope that we have all seen and are able to recognize little bright flashes of that heavenly kingdom breaking into this one. I think of a group of middle schoolers from Christchurch who wandered around downtown with burritos and bottles of water, looking for folks who hadn't had dinner yet and who probably couldn't afford to buy it. It looked like the streets were made of gold for a second down there on 4th and Demonbreun. I think of the French military veteran, Jean Vanier, who got a PhD in philosophy only to realize that his real calling was to live in community with people with severe intellectual and developmental disabilities, and that started a movement called L'Arche, where people with and without disabilities live together all over the world, and they take care of each other. Those houses he started have pearly gates. Did you know that? And they're always open. I think of all of us on Sundays coming to kneel at the altar rail, taking into our own bodies the body and blood of the one who loves us more than we can possibly imagine, who offers himself to us, that holy food and drink of new and unending life in him. We have seen these flashes, and we have participated in them. We know that there's something better coming, and that shouldn't cause us to check out of this world. It should cause us to be discontent with the world as it is. Because sometimes it seems far off, doesn't it? Sometimes the earthly city is all we can see, with its gun violence and its poverty and its pain. It is tiring to always be looking ahead to something else when the world around us asserts itself so strongly. We know that the heavenly city is so much better than the one we live in, but this is where we are. So we tell ourselves to be practical, not to hope for too much, to compromise the ideal here and there. We insulate ourselves from the world's pain. We find our own solutions instead of trusting in the steady work of God. Let me tell you about 2 moments in the life and faith of Abraham and Sarah. In the first, they've been promised a son, but they're old, and they know that Sarah can't possibly bear a child, so they think that maybe God needs a bit of help with this plan to make them into a great nation. They decide that Abraham should have a child with Sarah's servant instead. And so he does. But it leads to all kinds of suffering and anger, as you might imagine. And God tells them that they got it wrong, that Sarah really is going to bear a son. They believed the promise, but they didn't really trust that God could bring it about. The second moment happened later, after they'd had the son that God had promised them, though they still lived as nomads. Sarah died in the land that God told them would belong to their descendants, and Abraham paid an exorbitant sum of money to buy a field so that he could bury her there. He was still a foreigner in that land, but he believed the promise that it would belong to his descendants. So that was where he laid his dear wife to rest. He believed the promise and he welcomed it with his life, though he wouldn't see it fulfilled. Like Abraham and Sarah, we can try to figure things out on our own, relying on our resources and our common sense to get what we need. Or, also like Abraham and Sarah, we can welcome and live into the promises of God in our present lives. We can let the vision of the heavenly city change the way that we see and live in this earthly one. We will never do it perfectly. But we can let the beauty of what is promised to us shape our desires so that even the most luscious promises that the world has don't satisfy us. We can hold that vision in our hearts so that we don't settle for the cheap alternative, but keep working for the world as it is truly meant to be and as it one day will be. Though we might not see all the swords or guns beaten into plowshares in our lifetime, we can greet that day coming from afar and start hammering away at our own swords, trusting that it will be here in a little while. Because according to our text today, God isn't just the architect. God is also the builder. God is at work in this world, and though it is a long process, we can trust that the dust and mess of this world are signs of a heavenly building going up. As you, the people of Christ Church, wait for your own building in your own city to be completed, remember too to wait for that heavenly building, that heavenly city, and to watch always for signs of its coming. Amen.